Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this idea of an abundance and scarcity mindset. And it's something that I first learned about when I was reading this book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You may have seen it. It's a pretty well-known book. But as I was reading it, it was something that I realized is discussed pretty extensively in the Quran, and I think is something that can really add a lot of value to our lives. And so a lot of it stems from this idea of a zero-sum game. And the idea of a zero-sum game is one where there's a pie, and anybody who gets one slice of the pie means there's less pie for the rest of us. And so your goal in life is to get as much pie as you can, because if you don't, then other people are going to take it. And so it's a very limited idea that there's a scarcity of resources and there's constant competition for those resources. And after all, we live in a world where there's a lot of scariness, a lot of poverty, a lot of natural disaster, a lot of harshness. And so it's also known as a dog-eat-dog world, or eat or be eaten. And, you know, when we learn in our school the survival of the fittest and, you know, capitalism, competition, these are all the concepts that we learn. And it's ingrained in us at a very young age that there's abundant competition. And if you're not going to compete with one another, then you're going to lose. And this is something I've definitely seen, not only in our culture, but particularly in what I've seen in a lot of immigrant cultures, is there's a lot of this competition. And then when people come here, they bring a lot of that same mindset that they're going to go and achieve as much as they can and take as much as they can. And so it's definitely something that is ingrained in us, I believe. And so going along with this, just to kind of describe this scarcity mindset a little bit more, there's only so much to go around. And so anytime that somebody else wins or gets a piece of the pie, it means there's less for you. And so it's kind of hard to feel a lot of joy when someone else succeeds, because they took something that you could have been yours. And these people naturally don't want to share a lot of credit. They don't want to share a lot of power, a lot of profit. They don't want to really share it all. They want it all for themselves, or as much as they can. They want to get the biggest slice of the pie for themselves. And so you see they're always comparing themselves to one another, particularly among material possessions, because this is the most prized commodity that you can acquire. And in a way, sometimes these people can be rather insecure in the sense that they don't want to have a lot of competition even within their own group. So they like a lot of yes men, a lot of people that will affirm and work towards their path, usually to profit themselves. And so I always kind of like to use the analogy of the lobsters in a tank. You can imagine that these lobsters could easily get out of the tank if they climb on one another or they help each other out. But the reality of it is that in these tanks, the lobsters are often pulling each other back down because they don't want the other lobsters to get out. They want to be the ones to get out. And so the end result is basically nobody gets out. It doesn't help that they also tape the claws shut to help them, but the idea is that nobody gets out because everybody wants to get out. So the abundance mindset is a little bit different, and it really definitely requires a completely different perspective on this whole equation. And instead of having that insecurity about where your resources are going to be coming from, there's kind of an inner sense of peace coming, that there's plenty for everybody. And if you succeed, that's great. I hope that I can succeed too, but it doesn't take anything away from me. And so you're not threatened by other people's success. In fact, you may contribute to other people's success. And one of the key aspects that we'll talk about more is that these people seek win-win type of relationships rather than win-lose type relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And so instead of trying to compete against everybody head on, these people will try to form teams and coalitions, and then we'll try to gather everybody and then see if we can all succeed together and see if we can all build a platform that'll succeed. And I just want to give some examples about kind of some of the abundance that we have in this world when you really come to think about it, because, you know, when we talk about those earlier slides about how much scarcity mindset there is and how much competition there is for resources, sometimes it's important to step back and see what are the resources available around us and how much competition is there really. So for example, the sun is just a huge ball of energy. It's constantly producing energy through nuclear fission and other processes, and just a portion of that energy gets transferred to the earth. And in that one little portion of energy, there's more energy being produced than a whole entire year of energy produced by human beings. So just 1 hour of sunlight on the earth has more energy than a whole year of fossil fuels, nuclear power, wind power, all of these things. And so you're just thinking about the constant energy and abundance that's around us, that God has produced this world with so much energy that it's really just untapped potential. And it's really amazing. And I always find this one pretty interesting. The world GDP over the last 2 millennia, now for about 1900 years, there wasn't a whole lot going on. But after people started to realize some of the technologies that this earth has, we've seen really just an exponential growth in terms of what we're able to do. And you can see we're well past the 100 trillion mark. And even within that last 100 years, we're seeing a pretty substantial growth, even as of recently, even though we have those scary events and crises, even like the ones we have today. They're just small little dips in what's a pretty large upward curve. And the stock market increases about roughly 8% a year, and that kind of correlates in some ways with GDP. So we still have so much expansion that we have even with the population growth. I mean, it's really amazing to see this amount of growth even with almost 7 billion people on this earth. You know, you wonder really what we can do if we were to really all come together and see how we could all make it work. And then in other ways, we're also seeing, children who are malnourished are going down across the board. There's, even despite this huge amount of population growth, we still have plenty of food for everybody. In fact, we probably waste a large portion of food that could even supply a lot more people. And then life expectancy has increased dramatically over the last 200 years. In some countries, it's doubled. So it just goes to show you some of the resources that are around us, some of the problems that we've been able to solve just recently. I mean, we don't even know what the future could hold. So there is really abundance around us. There is really this tremendous amount of resources that are available to us. And so I want to talk a little about just how the Quran kind of ties in a little bit to this idea. And interestingly, there's a whole surah named after this idea of abundance. Kawthar is abundance. And it's kind of worth reflecting a little bit about this chapter because it actually teaches us a lot. It's only 3 verses. So surely we have given thee abundance of good. And so this is God talking to the prophet at a time when he was really pretty downtrodden in his path. And he already says that we've already given you abundance. And I find that interesting. And he says, so pray to your Lord and sacrifice. So he's saying to sacrifice even though you've given that abundance. At a time when he had nothing and he thought he was at the end of his ropes, he's saying sacrifice, you already have abundance. And it really takes you back when you have to think about that situation that you're in. When you're in the lowest point of your life and God is telling you you already have abundance and now sacrifice more and pray. And then God tells him, surely the enemy is cut off from good. So out of curiosity, who in this room is a Sayyid? Do we have any Sayyids in the room? Raise your hand. So we have, so you're in a sense a living proof of this verse, right? Because the prophet is told that he has been given abundance. And in this way, it was also tied to the idea of descendants. And at a time when the prophet had his two sons had died early in their lives, in a time when if you didn't have a male to succeed you, then you would be basically cut off from future generations. And then you have the opposition, which is enormously wealthy, has a tremendous amount of sons and family. How many people could trace their ancestry back to any of those people or even want to? But yet we have, probably the biggest population of people who can claim descendants of somebody is the prophet himself. It all came through his one daughter. It's really amazing. And imagine how many of the Ahlul were killed even after that point. This verse is really actually pretty miraculous when you think about just the time that it was revealed and in terms of how much it was able to produce. We can look back today and really get a lot from it. But it really shows that God is able to give abundance in ways that we don't even imagine. At a time when you're at the lowest point of your life, there's really plenty of room for hope and to think that things can get better. And here's another verse that I think is pretty telling. Indeed, those who the angels take in death while wronging themselves, the angels will ask, in what condition were you? And they'll say, we were oppressed in our land. The angels will say, was not the earth of Allah spacious enough for you to emigrate therein? For those, their refuge was hell, and in evil it is their destination. So these were people that were oppressed in their land, and as a result, they made excuses for their own behaviors. And I think a lot of the people in this room are an example of that, right? We may live in a country where there's not a whole lot of opportunity or for advancement. But as you can see from many of the people in this room, they came to this country and they were able to find abundance elsewhere. It doesn't mean there's abundance in every situation. Maybe you have to work a little bit for it and to make a change in your life. And that's one of the things that God has told us, that this earth is big and spacious and that there's opportunities elsewhere. So, and here's one more. The parable of those who spend their substance in the way of Allah is that of a grain of corn. It grows 7 ears, and each ear hath 100 grains. Allah giveth manifold increase to whom He pleaseth, and Allah careth for all those whom He knoweth all things. And so it's really an example of that doesn't make much sense in an economic standpoint, where if I give charity, then I get 1,000-fold reward. If you got a return on your investment of over 1,000-fold, I'd probably empty my entire portfolio into that. But we don't always think about how a return may not be just in the next year or two, but the real return is in the hereafter, right? This is the real 401k that we're trying to invest in. And Allah is really the giver of abundance. And so there's also in this article and books, it talks about some ways to cultivate this mindset, because really it's really ingrained in us from a very young age. And for example, when you're watching sports, there's a winner and there's a loser. When there's a court case, there's a winner and there's a loser. When you're in school, there's a curve. And when there's a curve, there's people who get A's, there's people who get F's. And so, but I think it's important to realize that this mindset is not applicable to many of the things in our lives. Our relationships, business transactions, they don't all have to be like this. And in fact, they probably should not be like that. So one of the ways that you can do that is to cultivate gratitude and to realize what you have, right? Because it's so easy to focus on what we don't have And that's what we focus on. And so when we focus on that, it leads to that scarcity mentality, that there's not enough. So we could have a house, a car, food in the fridge, everything set, but then, one aspect of our financial situation is wrong, and then we get into panic mode and we stop giving charity, we are hoarding money, we develop a lot of competitive mindsets that are not helpful to other people. And so sometimes it's good to just take account of what our resources are. Even if we don't have a lot of financial things, there's plenty of other things to have gratitude for. And this is something that I think is actually really helpful, and it's a very easy one to do, is that if you see somebody who's doing well, or maybe even has better than you, to really prevent yourself from having that envy, or to have that feeling, just say something nice to them. Say like, hey, you've done a great job with that. Like, hey, I'm really happy that investment worked out for you. I'm really happy that you succeeded in that job, because you know what? It doesn't mean I lost anything. You could succeed, and I could also succeed. And even if that's a time when maybe you think you deserved it, maybe there was a promotion that you got passed over for, and someone else got it. Who's to say that you may not get something better in the future? So why not just say something nice and build that connection with that other person? I really like this picture, but so opportunity, I think, is an important aspect to this, right? And it's also part of entrepreneurship or making connections, is that sometimes this idea of abundance can lead to more opportunity, right? So we can see where we can, if, for example, my job is not working out, maybe I can move to a different career. Or if this investment's not working out, maybe I can do something else. And maybe it's an idea that maybe I can add more value somewhere else. And so opportunity means that there could be just abundance that's somewhere else, and you may need to seek that out. And this one is probably the hardest, I think, is just to give more, because when you naturally have that scarcity mentality, you want to keep everything for yourself, and you don't want to give away anything. And so if you give something away, it kind of leads you to think that you maybe have a little bit more than you have. And as we can see, sometimes those returns from giving can be pretty nice. And I think this is another one that's pretty hard, is being mindful of your group. So if you're in an environment where you're constantly in this competition with other people, it can be quite difficult to really break out of that mindset. And so it's really good to associate yourself with people that want each other to succeed and are not constantly competing with one another. I found this in school to be something that was pretty helpful, is that sometimes in school there's, you're grading on a curve, right? And so there are certain people that they may get some resource or may acquire some knowledge, and they don't want to share it with anybody, because if somebody else gains that knowledge, they may get a higher score on the test, and then therefore I may get a lower score on the test. But I always found that the people who did probably the best were the people who found groups, and they freely shared their resources with everybody. Not only did people share it with them, but it's not like they were going to score any lower on the test. These people would form groups with one another, they would study with one another, and if you just study on your own, you're going to miss a lot of things, because there's so many things you could gain value from. Even from teaching another person, you can learn a lot from teaching. So I thought we could do an example of something that may helpful, rather than just give a talk, maybe give a little example. So if you have 2 volunteers up here, we have a little game we can play. Any volunteers? Okay, we got a volunteer.
Hassan wa Abi.
Okay, we have 2 volunteers. So you guys,
You want us to go?
yeah, if you want to come up here and grab a couple chairs. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a little negotiation scenario that I think is pretty common. So let me see which one I should give you. So Hassan, I'm gonna give you this one. And you guys want to face each other with the chairs sitting each other. Yeah. And then here's this one. So basically this scenario is going to be, let's say somebody wants to buy a car, and so it's been listed for $10,000, and the other person is trying to negotiate some sort of way to bring it down. And so each of you has your own scenario. You don't want to share it with each other. So so go ahead and read the card, and then you guys can start negotiating.
But not out loud.
Yeah.
Out loud?
Yeah, after you read it, start negotiating. See if you can create a scenario where both of you can benefit. No, you want to read that to yourself.
Yeah, read it.
And then use whatever it says. Okay. So one of you guys can start.
So does he have the same?
Huh?
Does
No,
it have-
he's the other
Oh, he's
person.
the other one.
Yeah.
Okay. So how much is this car?
$10,000.
Do you think I can get it for 9,000?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Cause my wife just suffered a medical emergency, and I need the money for the treatment.
I'm sorry to hear about that, but the value of the car is should be 9,000. It needs some fixing and some repairs, so I'll have to pay that from my end as well.
Is 9,500 okay?
I know it will cost me more than 1,000 to repair. So if you bring it to 9,000, so that's 1,000 from you, and then I'll add more to repair it. So 9,000, then I think it's a good deal.
Okay.
I want.
So, good job, guys. Thank you guys for coming. So this is a pretty common negotiation, right? You have one scenario. Thanks. One scenario where somebody's got a price point, and the other person has the other one, and it's basically two people trying to kind of a tug of war who can get the most, right? And obviously his dad was the one who won. But maybe in this scenario, can anybody think of a way that maybe this could have been maybe a win-win scenario for both of them? Because obviously, Hassan, he lost $1,000 on the car, and he really needed that money, right? And so what do you guys think could have been a scenario where they both could have walked away happy?
He sold it for 9,000 and gave him the profit once it was sold. Gave him some of the profit once he fixed the car and sold it.
Mm-hmm. What if he wanted to drive it himself?
Then he could have paid like monthly, he could have paid like 15 a month until it was.
Yeah. So he's saying maybe he could have paid in increments, but I think this guy wants the money now, right? This guy had a medical emergency. He needs the money right now. So I don't know about you, but like when I've been on Craigslist, I find people don't like people who are not serious. They don't want people who are going to mess around, and they want money right away. And that's what this guy really needed. He's stressed out. He needs money. Sometimes when I do these deals, I say, you know what? Here's the money, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to meet you wherever you want. We'll give you it to you in cash. There'll be no problems. We're going to just make this as quickly and efficiently as possible. And I think these are the hardest deals to make, right? Because we have to kind of think from the other person's perspective, because if we just think from our own perspective, we're never going to think about what's going to make a good deal for both sides. And I'll give you kind of an example that This is one of the examples that I've actually applied, and it was actually sort of useful for my own life. So when I was getting ready for the wedding, there's so many different people to negotiate with for different things. So when I was negotiating the food, I found that was much more negotiable than some of the other things because, the pricing and stuff, there was no set price. This is not a professional caterer. It was a Middle Eastern brother, and I visited him and I tried the food and I got the quotes, but the quotes were a little higher than I was wanting and I thought was appropriate. And so I was thinking to myself, how can I get the food, which I thought was good, and it was really probably the best person for the job, and how can I get this at a lower price without him feeling like he's getting ripped off in the same way? Because at the same time, like, he has a business to run too, and he's putting a lot of effort to give me this food. So I look around his restaurant, and I mean, there's not a whole lot of people there at the time. And I don't know what it's like all the time, but I get the feeling like, maybe he produces good food, but he's not getting a lot of customers. So maybe there's a way that I can add some value to him through this deal, right? Because this is going to be a catered event, and there's going to be a lot of people there. And so after I tried the food, I was thinking about it. And so the next day I showed up, and I said, hey, here's what I'll propose to you. I can't remember the exact numbers, but let's say it was $1,800 he proposed to me, and I said, I'm going to give you $1,500. I have it in cash, in full today, right now. And at the wedding, I'm going to show your restaurant, and I'm going to show that all that great food that you produced for me is from the restaurant. And there's going to be people from different ethnicities. There's going to be Iranians, Arabs there, white people there. There's going to be all these people who can see your restaurant and they taste the food, at the wedding, and it's going to be great for your business. And I noticed when I said that to him, he said, we do need to get some Iranians or other people in here because we only get maybe some Arabs or some other people. And so, he accepted based on that. And I also knew that when I did that, when I put his restaurant's name there, he's going to make sure that food looks good, right? He's not going to just get it out and then, his name's going to be on there. So now he's going to make good food for me too. And so I really like that scenario because I was able to add some value to him, and I was also able to get it at a price that I liked. And I thought the food would be better. And I think it was better because of that. He spent that extra time. Even though I paid him in full, I knew that he would still care. So I think that's an example here of what you call kind of a win-win, right? And so these are the ideal negotiation standpoint that you want to be in, is that you have both parties leaving happy. Because oftentimes in negotiation, somebody strong arms the other one, and then the other person feels like they got ripped off, right? Maybe they were in a desperate situation. And so that's what's called kind of the win-lose negotiation, right? You typically have somebody who has sort of an authoritarian mindset, and they say, I'm going to get my way and you don't get yours. And this is the whole zero-sum game, right? The scarcity mindset that I'm going to win every deal, at any cost. And so it doesn't really also seek a lot of values or understanding or relationships. It's more about just the material aspects of the money, the bottom line, and it's also kind of a very short-term transaction, right? Because you gain the benefit, but the other person has hard feelings about it at the end, right? And so then making future negotiation is pretty hard because that person may not want to return to you. In terms of just like, well, let's get to the lose-win one next. So the lose-win one is basically the type of negotiation where you're basically willingly overpowered, and basically you're saying, go ahead and have your way with me. So sometimes this can be just for people who are peacemakers. They don't want to create conflict. They want to be a part of the group. They're going to just seek strength from other people around them. And so it's usually very permissive and indulgent type people. But ultimately, these people kind of bury a lot of their feelings, right? They know they got ripped off. They're just not going to show it. And the lose-lose. So the lose-lose, you would think, like, why would anybody go to a lose-lose? But you'd be surprised how often you would do this. So, for example, have you ever seen one of those car auctions where people, they're competing with one another on a bid or something, and one person bids way more than the car is worth because they don't want the other person to win. So they lost themselves, but just because they didn't want the other person to win, they'll outbid something they didn't even want. Or another example that was used in this book that I thought was really nice or not really nice, it's really sad, but it was somebody who was going through a divorce and they had to split all of their assets. And so the guy, he just, that ate him up inside that his wife was going to take half of his wealth. And so what he did is he sold all of his assets for pennies on the dollar. So he sold his $10,000 car for $50. And then so when his wife got everything, it was just a penny, pennies on what he paid for it. And it was that kind of, that's really the definition of a lose-lose. And that typically happens when there's two win-lose people trying to negotiate with one another. So neither side wants to lose, or both sides want to win, but sometimes their desire to make the other person lose is even greater than their desire to win. And so then the last part that he talks about in this book is kind of the optimal scenario, which is a win-win or no deal. And it basically comes up with this idea that if we can both mutually benefit from this transaction, if our values are so far apart, why don't we just walk away from this and we can just find something else? We don't have to make this work. And in certain ways, this can be something we can apply in our own lives, right? So if we're with our own families, right, sometimes we put so much pressure onto a certain activity. Like, let's say we're going to pick a movie to watch one night, but nobody can agree on what to watch. Maybe it's just best to say, you know what, none of us are going to be happy with the movie that you select, so let's just do something else. It doesn't have to be one person, who just is pushing for a certain movie over the other person just to win. But I think kind of the aspect of it that this book doesn't get into, that I think the Quran really boosts, is that sometimes in a win-win, the win-win doesn't have to be right now or in this world. I can get a win-win by doing something like giving charity, right? I'm not going to get any return, any benefit from that charity, but God can ensure the rest of it at a much higher rate than anybody else could. And so I'm not necessarily looking every negotiation to win, even get something from it. I can get my reward from God. And I think that's really one of the key aspects here, that God is abundant. He has so much to give. He can give you as much as you want. And we shouldn't have to worry about losing any negotiation, right? If we're doing the right things, what are we going to lose? And I think that if you combine this book with the Quran and you really fuse these two concepts together, and I think you really have a powerful mentality that you can really change the way that you live, and really help each other out, form better teams, form better relationships, form better business. And that's kind of just what I wanted to share with you guys today. But I'd love to hear any comments or questions or anything that you guys want to bring up. Salawat.